Thank you very much. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Yes, thank you.
And we're excited to dive into this topic. It's been a bit of an obsession of ours these last 12 years, really understanding what drives breakthroughs in organizations, what drives innovation. And at the core of our new book is this notion that ultimately innovation is a muscle. It's not a moment, it's not an event, it's not a hackathon. It's a capability that needs to be developed like any other organizational capability. And yet, because this topic of innovation and creativity has largely been shrouded in mystery and misunderstanding, there are a lot of myths that keep people from engaging the muscle. And so what we want to do is we actually want to start with the opposite. And we want to say, what are the myths that keep people from treating innovation as a capability? And a lot of it comes from this idea in Silicon Valley. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this phrase, 0 to 1. So this notion that entrepreneurs especially, or innovators more generally, they have nothing, and then they come up with the, bright, shiny thing, the iPhone. There's nothing, and then there's Google. There's nothing, and then there's Facebook. And this mythology, although we like the book, by the way, that Peter wrote, it's a great book. It's a great handbook for entrepreneurs, yet the mythology around 0 to 1 and the implications of that, we feel, represent dangerous myths that if you aren't careful, you'll fall prey to them, and you'll actually be impacted by that wrong thinking. We recently heard a CEO of one of the largest companies in Silicon Valley say this statement: I'm not a 0 to 1 guy. Our founder was a 0 to 1 guy. I'm a 1 to infinity guy. As if he was giving people in the audience permission to engage, to embrace the fact that they aren't 0 to 1 people. And we take issue with that because we don't believe in 0 to 1 people. And so what we want to do is we want to talk about a couple of these myths, and we'll start with a quick story. This is Jerry Ueltzman. He's the assistant to the famous photographer Ansel Adams. And he's also a professor at the University of Florida. And Ueltzman ran a fascinating experiment that has implications for breakthrough thinking in organizations far beyond photography. But what he did in his classrooms, he divided it in half, and he said to half the class, at the end of the semester, we're going to have a jury of esteemed photographers come in and evaluate your work. And for half of you, the basis of their grading is this: you've got to make a spectacular photo. Okay, you only have to turn in one photo, but it has to be truly spectacular to get an A. If it's very good, you'll get a B. If it's pretty good, you'll get a C. But the quality of your photo is really what matters. To the other half of the class, he said, the jury's going to do something very different for you all. Instead of evaluating the quality of your work, they're only going to count how many photos you submit. If you submit 100 photos, it doesn't matter how bad any of them are, you're going to get an A. If you submit 90 photos, again, it doesn't matter what the quality is, you get a B, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the semester, Ueltzman and the panel of professional photographers were astounded by two findings. First, not a single person in this half of the class got an A, which is to say no one who was assigned the task of making one spectacular photo was able to do it. The second surprise was many of the students in this half of the class turned in an A caliber photo per the first group's criteria. Truly spectacular photos. Many people submitted them in the midst of their 100 photos. And what Ueltzman and his colleagues discovered is what research has proven true in numbers of fields, which is quantity actually leads to quality. And we see photos as a picture of sorts here, as a metaphor of sorts. These students' goal was to get an A in the class. Many of our goal on this call is to get an A or produce A caliber work in whatever kind of work we're doing. But the question is, how do you get there? And for the 0 to 1 mentality, a lot of times people think it's about going from 0, I don't have any good ideas, to I have the one idea that's really great. As if you have nothing, and then you do a little bit of work and you kind of get there, and you get there a little bit more. And then after a lot of work, you get to the one thing. And that's just not true, as the story about Jerry Ueltzman demonstrates. It's just not true. One of our heroes of research is a person named Dr. Dean Keith Simonton, and he conducted a longitudinal study of breakthrough thinking across disciplines. And what he found, not only in the arts, but also in the sciences and engineering and discovery, is that the single greatest variable that affects the quality of ideas in any field, whether it's artistic or scientific or otherwise, the single greatest variable is the quantity of ideas that that artist or scientist generated. And that's really fascinating to us as instructors, because people always come to us asking this question, how do I come up with good ideas? And we say that's not the goal. Instead of trying to come up with good ideas, you should be trying to come up with more ideas. And this is something that scientists and lots of people have known throughout the ages, and yet for whatever reason, it remains shrouded in mystery. Perry, I'm going to do that awkward pause that Michael did and say, Charles, it's your turn.
Oh yeah, yeah. So this is the other thing that's intriguing about what we've seen in organizations, or for all of you listening. And by the way, one benefit of having two speakers is we both have the Q&A line open. So one of us is always looking at that. So there's always like, this is gonna be real-time interactive. So if we're talking about something you want us to double down and talk a little bit more about it, if you're having any questions even related to context, like how would this matter, please drop them in the Q&A. We think questions are a compliment. We think if we're driving your curiosity, we're doing a good job. With that, this idea, this other sort of myth is around quantity, if you will. And the intriguing thing we found was we found so many teams and organizations not generating the amount of material needed to have a breakthrough. So then we dug a little deeper. And the good news working at a university is we can go, talk to researchers. We looked at some data generated by a colleague of ours, Bob Sutton, working with, at that point, a PhD student, Andy Hargadon, where they started with IDEO and then looked at a bunch of different industries, but basically came up with some data around, if you will, the number of ideas that is the first column here, 2,000 ideas needed to be generated. And at the other end, having a successful output, okay, one product or service making it to market. So they begin to look at this whole funnel, and they made their columns. The 100 represents the number of things prototyped or quickly flushed out. These are things that could take minutes to flush out. 5 things incubated, our definition of incubation, and the definition for them is things that were sustained as an offer. So they thought this was going to be an opportunity. So they sustained it and sort of, put some significant effort into figuring out if it might be viable or feasible. And then ultimately one thing coming out. So to me, this graph is always just extraordinary. And then you started digging and found really interesting, Dyson vacuums. For those of you who've read his book, it's an amazing story where, his column of a prototype was an idea for him. Everything he thought of, he built, but it was 5,000, I think, in that range of ideas leading to those first breakthrough products that had the, whatever it is, double vortex, whatever it is that he figured out how to do to have a bagless vacuum. But anyway, this is the amazing data that's super compelling. And to me, it's a big why for the book. So then if this is the why, that, wow, people are thinking it's 0 to 1 and there's no sort of frame around the amount of ideas needed, what does that mean? And that's kind of where the book takes off, is like, wow, then there's a lot of really interesting methods and things we didn't teach at the time we started doing the research about how to generate ideas. That's the thought.
No, I'm just kidding.
It's like, Michael, we need to be tapping our head or something. It's like it between those two.
Just one of these, yeah. So that's the first myth around quantity. The second myth, which is similar but is slightly different, is this notion that innovation requires intense focus. 0 to 1. If you think about that, it's like 0 is nothing and 1 is this very limited thing. If you think about the quintessential innovator, most people think of Steve Jobs, and people use this line of his to make the case for focus. Innovation is saying no to 1,000 things, right? And what's fascinating to us is not that he said no, but that he had 1,000 things. And that's what very few people realize, is being an innovator isn't about saying no to everybody. That's being a jerk. It's about having a volume of things that are worthy of evaluation. And if you think about it, think about Steve Jobs for a second. How did he get to true breakthroughs? What Sir Johnny Ive said at his memorial is he and Steve would sit down every day and they'd have lunch. And he said, every day, Steve would say some variation of, hey, Johnny, you want to hear a dopey idea? And Johnny said most of the time, the ideas were pretty dopey. In fact, sometimes they were truly terrible. But every once in a while, he said they would take the air out of the room and they'd leave us breathless, right? As only Johnny Ive can say. But the point is, Steve Jobs knew something that very few people do, which is ideas fall on a normal distribution. If you want to know what the quality of your ideas is, this is what happens. You've got some ideas that are really delightful. You've got a lot of ideas that are just plain ordinary. And then you have about as many ideas as are delightful. You've got dopey ideas, right? When we think of Steve Jobs, we don't think what a dope. We think in terms of disruption and redefining categories and customers being really, really happy, right? But Steve Jobs knew if you want to get to the delightful stuff, you've also got to be willing to share the dopey stuff. You've got to be willing to put it out there. What a lot of people, they want delightful ideas and they'll tolerate ordinary ideas, but they just hear this is going to be a little bit of sleight of hand here. Okay. So they just want to chop off the dopey end of the distribution. They just kind of do this. They just chop it off. And what they don't realize is that when they eliminate the variability that allows for dopey, they eliminate the same variability that results in delightful. You could, in fact, say that dopey is the price of delightful. And Steve Jobs, by being willing to share dopey ideas regularly, he was actually increasing his likelihood of discovering delightful ideas too. And ultimately, what that leaves you with is a decision. Which distribution do you want? Do you want delightful ideas? Then you have to put up with some dopey ones too. Or is your goal to avoid dopey ideas? If your goal is to avoid dopey ideas, that's fine. Just know you're not going to get any delightful ideas either, right? And so while the myth that innovation requires focus is pervasive, the truth is everything starts with a flare. And folks who are breakthrough innovators are breakthrough at flaring it and at generating not just volume, but variation in their thinking, which hopefully leads everyone here to ask this question: how do I boost the volume and variation of my ideas? And what we'd say is, we wrote a book on that topic called IDEAFLOW. The premise of IDEAFLOW is levers and tactics and methods and mindsets to boost both the volume of your ideas and also the variation of your ideas. And this is at the heart of our book. One thing that you have to be clear about, though, is idea can kind of be intimidating to people. This notion of an idea, because when we say you got to have thousands of ideas, people interact with that like we're saying you got to have thousands of tigers. You've got to have lots of this really scary thing. And what we'd say is we want to define idea in a way that's accessible for people, okay? Because basically what happens is, we'll tell it by way of a story. This is Bette Nesmith Graham. I don't know if you can see it in her eyes right now, but if you look closely, you can see she's on the verge of a breakthrough. Can you see it? This is 1956 in Dallas, Texas, near where Michael is right now. And she's working as a secretary at Texas Bank and Trust. And she's on the verge of a breakthrough, as we said. Not because she's doing something profound at her work. Right now, she's just typing on her newfangled typewriter by IBM, which is annoying her to no end because there's smudges and mistakes, and the filament is often leaving black marks on the page. So she spends a lot of her time actually erasing smudges on the page. But unlike a lot of secretaries in that day, she was a single mom. Her husband left after the war, so she was raising her son by herself, and she had to take up goofy side hustles to make ends meet. And one of the things that ushered in the breakthrough for her was she was working at a department store painting a window display. And she made a mistake as she was painting. She started trying to scratch off the mistake with her straight edge razor. And the painter came over and said, whoa, 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 what are you doing? And she said, oh, I'm just erasing this mistake. And he said, no, Bet, painters don't erase mistakes. This is about to change her life. He said, painters paint over their mistakes. And in that moment, she had an idea. And maybe many of you, as you're listening to this, you have the same idea, right? I came up with this idea to create a way to help secretaries paint over their mistakes, basically. She worked with one of her son's high school chemistry teachers and a local paint store employee to concoct the original formula for liquid paper. But the thing that's amazing to us is this is not exceptional. This is actually how ideas work. And it gets at this third myth, because there's this notion that from 0 to 1, some people make something from zero, from nothing. But what we'd say is that is cognitively impossible. What's an idea? It's Bette Nesmith Graham, who's frustrated by her typewriter, who learns that painters paint over their mistakes. In that moment, she made a connection. And an idea is simply a connection. You can think about it almost like Lego pieces coming together. Our brains can't create from nothing. Nobody creates something from nothing. Bette Nesmith Graham didn't invent liquid paper from nothing. She had cognitive building blocks. And the beautiful thing to realize, and it's incredibly liberating to us and the students that we work with, is nobody's 0 to 1, because everyone starts with cognitive building blocks. And what we want to do is we want to give you a couple of tips for how do you start to appreciate the Lego blocks that you have available to you in your life. Perry, you want to talk about this assignment?
Yeah. So we require our students, so if you think about students at our classes at Stanford, maybe is a good example, and I think there's an analog to the business world, they're working on a project. So they're, maybe we're working on, improving a healthcare experience or something like that. They might go, pay attention in their own lives to keeping a bug list and keeping a bug list around any kind of aggravation they have. A lot of the STEM for it, we like think about Mad Libs as a kid, if you did Mad Libs. It sucks that blank. So they would just write in, oh, it sucks that, the toothpaste spills out of the toothpaste tube. It sucks that the toothbrush gets gross after a while. It sucks that, and by keeping this bug list, we talk a lot in the book about the value of sort of asking really interesting questions. So these could be all prompts that you generate ideas on, or it could be that at the same time, they're getting ideas around this bug list. They had this challenge and they're keeping a list of different ideas, and it's haphazard. And I would think about that idea as a practice, as something we have seen sort of categorically through interviews, people that do have a lot of creative output and their teams have a lot of creative output. There's some version of this that they're doing. There's a notebook. It's usually within arm's reach of me here, but there's a whole bunch on the counter here. But I've got Post-its with all kinds of, wackadoodle ideas for this presentation I'm supposed to give, right, in 2 weeks. And I'll go through them at some point. But I've been just stacking up. I'm using green Post-its for some reason. And every time I ask them, I take a green Post-it and I slap an idea down for that, or I see a presentation that I didn't think went well, I'd put a bug and, keep a list and go back and forth. But this idea of having a practice around that is the big idea in the book. Is the sooner you have it and it becomes something that's a resilient practice you have in your life, the sooner you can point that effort toward a particular challenge or have a team have a resilient ability. A few of Iroy's asking some questions about idea generation, having the resilient practice to generate a lot of ideas. That's if there's a big idea, that's the big idea. And then you can use that ability to tackle problems.
Yeah, each bug, each thing that annoys you is a Lego, so to speak. But being aware of problems and cultivating an awareness of problems, as essential as it is, it's insufficient if you're not also looking out for connections. And here's the other big thing that you have to do is you have to be on the lookout. Michael mentioned the late comedian Robin Williams earlier. Our mentor, David Kelly, was good friends with him. And he said, Robin always carried a yellow legal pad around with him everywhere because he's always writing down bits of dialogue that would work their way into his stand-up act later that day, right? But he was on the lookout. He was expecting the world to inspire him. And that's a practice. It's a habit. One of our favorite stories of this is this gentleman here, Bill Bowerman, co-founder of Nike, Oregon's track and field coach, the US Olympic track and field coach at that tragic Olympics. He is known for this breakthrough moment. And many of you probably know the breakthrough moment. We got to give a shout out to his wife, Barbara, because she was cooking breakfast. She's making waffles And Bowerman's sitting at the kitchen table, and as any good engineer would, he's looking at the waffle maker and he thinks, I should pour polyurethane in that. And he did, and he ruined her waffle iron. And then he went on to perfect the formula, and he made the first waffle trainer. This is the product that took Nike basically from being a import exporter of Onitsuka into an entirely category redefining product, not only for track and field, but athletics more broadly, and then the broader casual market. And you might think, okay, wait, so is what these Stanford professors telling me is that I should look at kitchen appliances to get inspiration? No, when we say look out for connections, we're actually referring to Bowerman's habit of constantly tinkering, of constantly trying new things. Phil Knight tells a story about how anytime as an Oregon track star, he went into the locker room, Bowerman has always opened up all the athletes' lockers, and you never know what you're going to find in your locker, what kind of change, what kind of iteration, what kind of experiment he's going to have you wear onto the field. And he said, we didn't know if we're going to hobble off the track bleeding or if we're going to win the race, because he's removing pounds from our stride in all different ways. But this is the kind of person who sees inspiration in the waffle iron. He's looking for inspiration everywhere. He's the first person to invent the kind of modern, almost bouncy track, because he had this idea from tires, right? And this person who keeps a notebook not only of his athlete's performance, but also a notebook of his experiments performance, this is the kind of person who has a breakthrough moment at the waffle iron. And the point is, nobody's making something from nothing. Nobody's starting at zero. Bill Bowerman he wasn't sitting at his kitchen table with no knowledge of shoes, with no knowledge of track and field, with no experiments in the hopper. No, he had a deep knowledge, and he was constantly experimenting, and he saw something in the waffle iron. Bette Nesmith Graham wasn't, napping when she materialized liquid paper from thin air. No, she was frustrated with her typewriter and she's working odd jobs, but they're looking for connections. When they look for connections, the world ends up surfacing unexpected possibilities. And that's where we would say this fundamental shift that we're trying to invoke with IDEAFLOW is shifting from, hey, we're going to have a sprint and all of the great ideas are going to come up in this 1.5 day long session we've got, or we've got a workshop coming in, or we've got a hackathon, or whatever it is, right? And when we kind of compartmentalize innovation to this moment in time, we miss the opportunity for these serendipitous connections to be formed. It's been said that the history of innovation is the bus, the bed, and the bathtub. None of those things are the workshop moment. All of those things are the kind of in-between space. But our perspective is there are things that you can do to practice, to build the muscle, much like you practice a sport, much like you practice the piano. You can actually build your innovation muscles. And that's what the rest of the book really advocates is, what are some tools, what are some mindsets that you can bring into your day-to-day life to increase the likelihood of unexpected connections, novel solutions to problems that can really change the world, change your organization and change your customers and your employees' lives for the better. And the practice mentality is very different than an event-based mentality, a capability building mentality. If we were to ask you, what's the last thing you did to flex your innovation muscle? What would you say? What would your team say if you asked them, what's the last time you flexed your innovation muscle? Almost everyone points to an event, and we think that's a shame. The last time you did piano wasn't when you booked Carnegie Hall, right? The last time you flexed your swimming muscle wasn't when you did the big race. We see that there's an opportunity to bring more mindfulness to the capability of innovation than most folks typically bring. And that's really what the book is about. I think with that, we'd like to take a pause. We'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. If you want to follow up with some of these ideas, we've got both of our LinkedIn connections available there. But we'd like to actually now have a conversation. I know Michael had a couple of questions that he wanted to ask as well. So Michael, if you want to jump on.
Well, Kate asked a really good question in the Q&A that I think is super interesting, maybe to kick things off, then I'll let Michael hop in. But the question was about looking at other disciplines to get ideas. And I think that was one of the things, Kate, that was super fascinating about idea generation, that if you will, we're all going to walk through our day and we're going to get exposed to a lot of different inputs. Okay, now I'm sort of obsessed. I mentioned before, I've got to give a presentation. It's not on IdeaFlow, it's on something else. Something actually I don't understand very well. So I'm a little bit nervous about it. But so I'm going to give this presentation and it sounds goofy, but if I hold in my head, how am I going to ask a compelling question at the beginning? And I think I do want to do that. So I want to do that. If I go through my day now, see, and her question is about other disciplines. And I wonder, well, I'm going to go, to the grocery store and I'm going to ask somebody who's helping me about how to make something. How does that interaction work? I might jot down some notes, but if I use the world and the many different disciplines I'll come in contact with my question, I can generate an enormous amount of ideas. And I think it was maybe Ira who's been crushing it on the questions, ask a question about, what you do in the office and out of the office. And that's those two sort of intermingle this really interesting thing of we can generate a lot of ideas as human beings on our own if we seek unexpected input from our day and our world by just sort of holding a practice of writing things down like a bug list, but also holding that question. My question is, wow, when do I hear some interesting questions throughout my day? I'm going to jot them down and I will have more input and more ideas to drop on more of these green Post-its, which I happen to be using for this, right? And I'll have more of those at the end of the day with which to compare and contrast and get myself unstuck, and I think that's an amazing thing. I think that's about resiliency as just an individual. And actually getting excited about your work and sort of being able to generate that on your own, and not think of idea generation as purely brainstorming or combinatory with other people. And that is valuable. And we can get into that a little bit. But anyway, Michael, you're back.
I've been here the whole time. So
all right.
Great.
You never left. We knew it.
All right. So there's a format for people to post some questions. I've got some questions that had already come pre the webinar, and we'll also sort of go through those. But I get, as the moderator, the opportunity to ask the first question, which is, describe the mindset of the innovation or idea generator contributor before their mouth opens. What are they thinking about, and why are they even coming into a situation where psychologically I see a problem and I'm going to react to it in my own head? What's the mindset of a person like that? Can companies inspire it, or you just are like that, and we will, just for the purposes, not get into the how do you get people into the right frame of mind? But I'll leave that to you, because I think you got to begin with how that brain is working first.
The first word that comes to my mind is care. If you don't care, don't bother. I've never seen inspiration strike an apathetic individual, ever. And so what is going through the person's mind is they have a sense of care for the organization, the customer, the annoyance that's bothering them. It's not apathy. And I think one of the great enemies of innovation in organizations today is actually apathy. People are phoning it in. They don't actually care. I think it's deeply related. We can talk about this later if you want, but it's deeply related to the idea of pride. But care is the fundamental psychological characteristic of the innovator.
I also think, Michael, the burden for you is the questions. And I think if there's, you have a very engaged group here, at least Kate, Ira, and Rob. I've enjoyed your questions. Maybe there are others on there, but the role of a leader and the role for you, if you're coming to a team and wanting them to, be able to sort of spark ideas and bring their full self to whatever the challenges you're facing, it's asking really good questions. And then we talk a little bit about this is, how are we going to grow our participation numbers, for our podcast? Is like, that's a question, right? Another question might be come to the team and say, how are we going to make unbelievable advocates in our listeners? that this is the center of what they want to talk about with their peers. How do we do that? And that you can see the valence of those questions, right? One might be perhaps a little bit more interesting and engaging. And I think there's great questions to be asked. And I think that's one of the things we talk about in the book, is being thoughtful about, we phrase them as how might we questions. How might we make a podcast that makes a big difference in climate change? How might we make a podcast that makes our listeners advocates? How might we make, that's one, if I'm making sense, like those questions, hopefully for your listeners are even sparking, like those are really compelling, interesting ways to frame up kind of the same thing. But that's a bit of the role of the leader is to spark that with folks and get them to make the collisions in their head and start generating ideas. And then the other part the leader does is make it safe to speak up. Amy Edmondson wrote a great book about this. I can't remember what it's called, but
Fearless Organization.
What's that?
The Fearless Organization.
About emotional safety. And I think that's the other thing is, one of the things we've sort of passed over is to get teams, to generate a lot of ideas. You also need to create the conditions it's safe to do that, that there's not going to be judgment. There's not going to be, we're in a generative mode, and that is awesome and expected. And people ask, what are the rewards for ideas? The rewards for ideas are, let's as a team generate, like we take pride in our ability to generate. This is an important metric we care about for our team and our associates at work, is that they generate a lot of ideas and bring those ideas to work and feel comfortable doing that.
So I think before we again go into the specific questions, I think that's a great segue to the practical application of the principles, because there are a lot of people leaders, I'm sure, on this call, whether at large scale enterprise level people leaders versus sort of large teams, small teams. Illustratively, if the purpose and agenda of the people leader interested in this context is to generate valued, whether they were great ideas or average ideas or poor ideas, everybody got that point. What's a good way to hold a meeting or a initiative? It doesn't necessarily have to be sit down, come up with good ideas. Could be over the next month, we're all going to talk about this. And what's a bad way to do it, that they may come away with some of, guardrails, let's just say, that they should operate. I think people would find that, of great value given your perspectives.
Yeah, a simple way to say it, the bad way is to do it all in one go. To assume that it's this moment is when we're going to do it, this 30-minute meeting. It's like anytime people hear the bell, to come to the conference room, they aren't thinking, now's my chance. They aren't looking forward to it. Rarely are they looking forward to it. So in a single go that's almost always our desire, because of a psychological tendency called the longing for cognitive closure. Right? It's distressing. It's psychologically distressing to us to leave things unresolved. And so our tendency is to want to open and close an issue, a problem ticket in the same sitting, right? And so we don't like to sit with ambiguity well, but there's very little evidence that suggests that early ideas are the best ideas, hardly any at all. And so the thought that we're going to solve this in a single go, while it appeals to kind of our reptilian desire for certainty, doesn't really do a great job of surfacing the best ideas. If you're going to do something other than one go, a simple kind of 4-step model, not that this is even codified this way necessarily in the book exactly, but a simple 4-step model is the following. 1, let people know the question or prompt or challenge and give them a chance to think individually before you ever meet. So this is an individual activity. You make them aware of the problem or the opportunity, individually consider it, and set the expectation. I'm eager to hear ideas whenever we get together. Okay. 2, when you get together, create an environment where people are not judging one another's ideas, but building on each other's ideas. We call it deferring judgment, but it's separating idea generation from idea evaluation. Okay. So in that first interaction, it's all about building. It's all about, being, as we call it at the D School, being sparkable. That's the second thing. Third thing, instead of making decisions at the end of that meeting, tell people we're not going to decide until the next time we meet. And we have the expectation that our best ideas collectively probably haven't come up yet. And the research we've studied demonstrates that the best ideas often come to people after the meeting if they know a decision hasn't been made yet, right? So giving people permission and setting the expectation that better ideas are going to come. And then the fourth step is when we meet again, let's not only meet to evaluate the stuff we talked about last time, let's also share the better ideas that have come to us in the interim.
Terry, did you want to add to any of that?
Yeah, no, that's it. That's it.
Okay, I love that response. I'll throw one curveball. I promise it's the last of personal questions. That is, given some of the work and space that we play in building these sort of social networks within companies around pride and communications and feedback, some of these can be themed. Some of them might be wellness-orientated messaging, promotion recognition, onboarding appreciation, good job customer service feedback, innovation with large enterprise, different time zones, nobody's meeting each other, right? Has it the potential to work in that construct with posting ideas, eliciting reactions, or maybe interesting, we are more comfortable with we're in a room or we're in a team or we're in a few chats, very sort of, and does it change when one considers scale or remote? Or good question, and
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there's also the other one I'd add in there is, you've got these remote situations and everybody's got a busy schedule. So it's very asynchronous all the time. And the good news is it's actually ideal for idea generation. We are half of us in theory are introverts, right? So that half of us hated brainstorming maybe, or it was deeply uncomfortable, this group stuff, and being on your toes and have to answer and do all that stuff. So I think we've talked a bit about some of the concepts, but as a leader, maybe I'll give an example. There's a past student that has a ritual now with Teams that she sends out a question along with in Microsoft Teams, a spreadsheet, and there's a question, and everybody needs to find, the call is, you need 5 minutes in your day to jot down at least 5 to 10 ideas based on this prompt. So one of them I know was about a sales meeting. They wanted to do something different in a sales meeting. I need some ideas. How do we kick it off? Let's get it. And I forget the scale of the team, but it was something on the order of 50 ideas. And then right before the meeting starts, which was actually still a Zoom meeting, everybody had an ability to up select and down select ideas. So they just put a bunch of numbers in and then they reveal the numbers. And it sort of gave them a chance to then have a deeper discussion about, the 2 or 3 or 4 concepts that had really captured people's attentions, why they captured, and there was that collaborative moment, right, where we're really engaged, but we've generated the mountain of material. We've then actively selected at a different time. And then the time synchronous together, even though it was still Zoom, we sort of is bounded. Like we're going to talk about idea 1, idea 2, idea 3, idea 4. And it was easier for them to drive innovation with leveraging the fact that people have different contexts, leveraging the fact that one person's on logistics, the other person's actually one of the salespeople, all these things, because the ideas were very, very different, right? So imagine their perspectives on this sales meeting. If I'm running logistics, my perspective is entirely different than the salesperson. And if I can do that independently and write my own ideas, that's an amazing example to me of leveraging the different contexts, leveraging the different backgrounds, bringing them together. And the leader was thoughtful about pose a question, give people time to generate ideas, separate selection. We're going to do selection right before our in-person meeting. And then we're gonna actually have a vigorous discussion around a few of them. Where we combine ideas and sort of, have the other portion of ideation, which is the combinatory piece, What's your interpretation of the idea? What's my interpretation? And sort of put it together. And I think that last piece I want to clarify, and maybe for your guests, that piece is really important because that makes it our idea. You know, there's this big difference, you know, first person singular, first person plural, you know, that you want things to be first person plural if you're going to have a team. And I think in idea generation, we don't want to leave you thinking the best thing to do is just, you know, walk around and keep my own personal bug list. That's a really good practice. And combining it with other people, that's what I think creates the magic with innovation and buy-in and mutual understanding and turning ideas into team ideas from individual ideas.
Innovation versus progress, right? And
Yeah.
who's been involved in a team where someone was initiated, they got the committee involved, and they ended up, instead of a single color paint, it's gray because we had to accommodate everybody's ideas. Balance, but that might be progress versus innovation. But you know,
Yeah.
let me go to some of the questions. Not fair. I am hogging your time. All right. So Lanny, BA Innovation, KWM. What techniques do you use to warm people up for ideas? Maybe you feel like you've answered that, but if you wanted to add to give Lanny any further details, please.
You know, Lanny, here's a fun one. If you sound like maybe you spend some time in facilitation mode. One of our favorite games to play to warm people up is a game that we call the gift game, where you basically, especially on Zoom, it's really fun. And Perry and I will demonstrate it for you now. But you basically find something that can be, that could be a gift. And then you give it to your partner and they have to respond with, oh, good, and say why it's like the perfect thing. So it's got to be, you know, neutral or good, right? So for example, Perry, I've got this roll of gaffing tape for as a present.
Oh, good. You know, I need to tape the door closed at night here because we have for some reason mosquitoes coming in. So I want to tape the seam closed. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so that's what you do. You do the first one and everybody goes around. And that's, well, to me, I thought Perry's response was very creative and very interesting and fun. Well, everybody does that. And then you say, okay, round two, everyone has to choose something objectively bad. Okay, not good, not neutral, but objectively bad. And let's see, Perry, I found this this wad of packing tape in the trash can.
Oh, good. I just had my flu shot and I was just really curious if it works. So touching things filled with germs sounds like a good way to test that.
Perfect. So yeah, Michael's doing the demonstration of licking it, you know, like an apple.
Yeah, exactly.
So what you see there, and you know, typically we could go around the horn and everybody does it. The point is, almost always the responses to the bad stuff are, we laugh more, they're more inventive, they're more fun. And the fundamental point that we're trying to drive home there is, there's no such thing as a bad idea in that sense. Meaning the bad stuff we give each other actually has the potential to be turned around into something more wonderful. And having that mindset of, my job, assume people give me crap. Everybody on my team is coming in with crap ideas. Well, is my job to shoot them down and say why they're no good? Or is my job to actually make them better and to turn even the, you know, wad of cellophane, you know, tape from the trash can into a really inventive way to discover the efficacy of a vaccine, right? And that's the mindset we want to bring in. And there are loads of, you know, techniques like that, but simple, fun things that get people laughing, that get people to shift the mindset from whatever the norm is to what you want in that moment, that's really the point.
So here's a great question. Evelyn Jensen, Learning and Development Manager, CJ America. It's not feasible for me to teach experts. How do I raise the voices of the novices when they're all in the room, or at least in some kind of, you know, visual constraint so they can see each other?
Yeah, so we had again, just a past student, I thought did a really interesting ritual, which was the youngest employee, the newest employee was always the first to contribute. And it just became a norm, so you can change a default, and actually decide, and you can talk about it. I mean, take I forget what chapter it's in. There's a chapter that you can cite the research and you can do all the geeked out stuff. So you convince people this is a task worth doing. But there's so much interesting research about, somebody asked about this, is how do you get, a beginner mindset? The best thing to do, these novices, an amazing thing would be to hire a summer intern and invite them to all these meetings. And they have all kinds of ideas because they don't have any preconceived conception about the business. And maybe a challenging thing is to get people to understand this is idea generation. So we're seeking quantity. So we value the sort of, maybe hopefully orthogonal and very, very different ideas a novice is going to bring to the table. But I think we've all had that experience of, starting a new job or something like that. And, and seeing the business very, very differently than when you see it when you've worked there for a year. So there's leverage in that. And my advice to them would be to change a default around it. So it doesn't become something you have to advocate for or try to. It's just make it a normal procedure that we seek out novices and we actually want their contributions early on, that's really helpful for us.
So in that context, does innovation require a moderator and a facilitator to flint spark the fire, or that's a different, there's two different processes. One, we just want innovation to happen and we are not assigning a responsibility to one of the attendees on this or other. Your job is to, versus we would like an innovative culture, and how do we do that? Maybe two different, responses, or however you'd like to respond.
One thing I'd say is start with process first before you think about who. Think about the process. And I have, I have a process around my workout. And maybe many of your listeners resonate like, yeah, I go to a workout class on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It's a program. I do this thing. I get up in the car. I have this whole program around my fitness, or I have this program around my diet. I would think about getting clear with maybe a team you trust and work with closely. Let's talk about our innovation process. Let's talk about, how we want to, drive, ideas forward. You could rotate. In that case, you could then rotate if there's some responsibility for, gathering ideas, getting a question out to the team in advance, like that example I gave of the past student who was sending out a notice to her sales team. That's, to me, they have now a process, and maybe the next step for her is to hand that off to somebody else on the team. She doesn't need to be the one sending the question out. Somebody else could do it. The process is clear. And I think that's maybe the more resilient thing to think about is begin to put some process around your own personal innovation efforts, and also the efforts of your team that are more resilient and clear.
Michael, I want to make sure, I don't want to interrupt if you've got another question, but one thing I just wanted to mention, because I feel WorkProud, I so align with and appreciate your mission and your values, and workers that feel a sense of pride in what they do are effective workers, they're happy workers, they're engaged workers. And to me, this notion of innovation and effective problem solving, we believe that IDEAFLOW helps people solve the problem of solving problems for good, because it gives you the answer, the meta answer, right? And so the thing that I would say, if I want to try to connect IDEAFLOW to pride, to WorkProud, workplace pride, et cetera, there's some fascinating research at Stanford by a couple of our colleagues that we've had a chance to engage, where they talk about this idea of beliefs and behaviors. And do beliefs drive behaviors, or do behaviors drive beliefs? And the conventional wisdom is beliefs drive behaviors. right? So get people to believe they're innovative or they can be creative, and then they will, or, and the canonical example in this case was a long time ago, Wells Fargo's NPS scores in their branches were plummeting. And they went on a road show to try to get tellers to value the customer, right? And NPS scores continued to plummet despite the belief-oriented kind of, what's the word, intervention. They changed and identified a simple behavior that would change the narrative. And what they did was they put a prompt on the screen, which was, please enter the customer's eye color before they could enter their information. And what that caused tellers to do is look into the eyes of the customer. The customer immediately thinks, oh, right? The employee actually feels that connection, right? But NPS scores started to go up, and employee satisfaction actually started to raise. But it was a behavior-oriented intervention. What we would say, what's the relation to WorkProud and IDEAFLOW? The best definition of creativity that I've ever heard comes from a 7th grader in Ohio. Okay, we have a K-12 department that works with public educators all over the country and all over the world. And the leader of that department is friends with a principal there who snapped a photo of this poster because it was so great. She sent it to us, and it says, creativity is doing more than the first thing you think of. And that is a profoundly psychologically accurate definition, actually. Turns out it's very difficult to do more than the first thing you think of because, again, our bias towards closure. If I think of a solution, great. And yet all of us we can immediately call to mind situations where the easy fix wasn't, the quick fix actually wasn't that quick and it didn't really fix things, right? So the behavior that we advocate for any individual on a daily basis is take one problem where you're looking for the right answer and change your goal. Look for 10 answers. Not the right answer, 10 answers. And by changing the goal, you are by definition making people creative. If I tell you to come up with 10 solutions to this problem, according to the 7th grader in Ohio's definition that creativity is doing more than the first thing you think of, I've just given you a behavior that is inherently creative. And there's a lot of problems in organizations that aren't math problems, meaning there's way more than one right answer, right? Granted, accounting problems are math problems. There's one right answer. I grant that. Most of the problems we're facing in business aren't math. They have lots of possible answers. And if employees would get in the habit of, and if leaders would get in the stewardship of helping people engage this tendency or this behavior of generating more answers than they think they need, they would be getting their people to be creative. They would be invoking pride in the workplace because there's a sense of agency there. There's a sense of ownership there. If I'm solving problems, I matter to this place, right? And that's to us, it's a deeply, it's a very simple tactic that has outsized ROI.
All right, I love that. Well, we're at the hour. Firstly, everybody, we will be sending out information follow-up email with Jeremy and Perry. I think maybe your LinkedIn profile, that would be helpful, or you'll let us know, as well as a link for a claim form to enter address information so we can ship the book. Apologize if I didn't get to answer everybody's questions. I might send them across to Perry and Jeremy and see if we also want to put additional written responses attached to that. But thank you everybody for your time on a Thursday, whatever part of the world you're in, and wish you guys all a best great end of this week. Again, on behalf of the audience, Jeremy and Perry, thank you very much for taking time out of your day. It's all the best to you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.